Guten Abend, meine Damen und Herren. Ich darf Sie recht herzlich auch im Namen der Direktorin des Hygiene-Museums Dresdens von Dr. Edenheiser herzlich willkommen heißen. Es ist heute eine ganz besondere Freude, so viele hier zu sehen, obwohl man ja sagen muss, im Hygiene-Museum kommt das des Öfteren vor. Noch größer ist die Freude, dass wir heute Abend Lea Ypi hier haben. In diesen Tagen, wo sie viel gefragt ist, das neue Buch vorzustellen, ist es uns aber gelungen, sie nach Dresden zu locken. Das ist für uns eine große Freude, liebe Lea, und wir danken dir recht herzlich, dass du den Weg nach Dresden gefunden hast. Wie immer in Dresden sind solche großen Veranstaltungen zumeist Kooperationsveranstaltungen, in diesem Fall von dem Hygiene-Museum, von der Henry Arnold Dresden Summer School, die in diesen Tagen viele aus verschiedenen Ländern, junge Leute, Wissenschaftlerinnen, Wissenschaftler, Museumsschaffende, Kulturschaffende hier versammelt in Dresden. Gestern begonnen im Albertinum, wo wir über Kunstfreiheit diskutiert haben. Heute werden wir über Freiheit, Würde und den Problem der Aufarbeitung von Vergangenheiten sprechen. Lea Ypi ist Ihnen sicherlich bekannt durch die Lektüre des Buches Frei. Frei ist ein Weltbestseller gewesen, ist, wie man so schön sagt, highly acclaimed, also sehr gefeiert worden. Ein Buch, das den Nerv derer trifft, die in Transitionsgesellschaften leben, also auch in Ostdeutschland nach 1990 sich mit einer gänzlich neuen Welt zu arrangieren hofften, wie mit Träumen, Hoffnungen in die neue Zeit gingen, aber die auch gleichzeitig vieler Enttäuschungen, manche auch Traumatisierungen erlebten. Das ist ein Teil des Buches von Frei, es ist aber auch ein Buch über das Leben in einer Diktatur. Und ganz am Ende, wenn Sie das Buch noch erinnern, kommt die Passage, dass Lea Ypi Albanien verlässt, nach Rom geht, nach Italien geht und dort auch ein Studium beginnt. Was sie dort studieren will, darüber reden wir vielleicht nachher einmal. Was sie heute darüber denkt, über das, was sie vorhatte, auch darüber reden wir später. Sie studierte in Rom an La Sapienza Politik, Philosophie, Literatur und Journalismus und hatte auch 2 Abschlüsse. Dann ging sie an das schöne Europäische Hochschulinstitut in Florenz, genauer gesagt in Fiesole, und dort erhielt sie den Master of Research und erlangte auch die Promotion, den PhD. Danach war sie lehrend tätig in England, Worcester College, University of Oxford, dann am Nuffield College. Danach ist sie ein bisschen in die weite Welt gegangen, nach Australien, war dort außerordentliche Professorin an der Universität in Canberra. 2013 ist sie dann wieder nach London gegangen oder ist sie nach England gegangen und an die London School of Economics und ist dort seit 2016 Professorin für politische Theorie. Sie schreibt regelmäßig für Journals, für The Guardian. Das Buch Frei, von dem ich bereits sagte, auch 35 erschienen in 35 Sprachen, gewann eine Reihe von Preisen und ist auch von der New York Times als eines der wichtigsten 10 Bücher des Jahres, ich glaube, es war 21, bezeichnet worden. Also es ist wirklich ein Buch, das viele bewegt hat und ich habe auch in vielen Gesprächen im Vorfeld dieses heutigen Abends gehört, dass Sie das Buch für eigentlich das Wichtigste halten, was Sie in den letzten Jahren gelesen haben und dass Sie sich selbst und auch die Transitionszeit in Ostdeutschland mit diesem Buch besser verstanden haben. Wir reden aber heute Abend über ein anderes Buch, das neue Buch. Indignity im englischen Titel geheißen, im Deutschen heißt es Aufrecht, auch darüber können wir nachher mal diskutieren, wie solche Verschiebungen in der Titelgebung zustande kommen und was sie eigentlich bedeuten und was sie sagen über das Publikum, welches solche Bücher liest. Es ist ein Buch, das ich gar nicht weiter jetzt vorstellen will, weil das macht Lea Ypi. Es ist ein Buch, das handelt auch von der Biografie ihrer Großmutter. Es handelt aber auch von den Schwierigkeiten, in einem Land zu leben, Albanien, kommend aber aus dem Osmanischen Reich, welches ein Vielvölkerstaat ist, welches Verwerfungen in politischer Hinsicht ausgesetzt ist und wo man auch den Übergang von der einen Diktatur in die andere Diktatur hat erleben müssen. Dem ist die Familie ausgesetzt, dem ist die Großmutter, die im Zentrum des Berichtes steht, ausgesetzt. Es geht um moralische Integrität, um das Aufrechtsein im Spannungsfeld auch autoritärer Regime. Und es geht um Archivmaterial, es geht um persönliche Zeugnisse, es geht um Erinnerungen, es geht auch um Philosophie und politische Theorie. Soweit ein kurzer Blick auf das, was Sie jetzt gleich erwartet. Lea Ypi wird zunächst eine Passage aus ihrem Buch, aus dem Prolog, lesen. Sie wird das in englischer Sprache tun. Ihnen liegt der Auszug in deutscher Übersetzung vor, als Kopie aus dem Buch. Sie können gleichzeitig auch gerne der Übersetzung lauschen, die aber, wenn ich das jetzt richtig verstanden habe, beim ersten Teil nicht erfolgt, sondern dann im zweiten Teil. Aber Sie können bitte dabei beachten, dass Lea Ypi etwas kürzt und nicht den gesamten Prolog, der Ihnen jetzt in deutscher Übersetzung vorliegt, tatsächlich lesen wird. Danach wird sie einen Vortrag halten, der die Komplexität des Buches, wie ich finde, ich kenne den Vortrag bereits, sehr schön darstellt, auch sehr schön erzählt. Dieser Vortrag wird in englischer Sprache sein, weshalb diejenigen, die vielleicht die Feinheiten so schnell auch dann nicht in englischer Sprache verfolgen können oder wollen, sich bitte der deutschen Simultanübersetzung bedienen. Dafür sind diese Headsets da. Bitte auch direkt, da bin ich ermahnt worden, Sie darauf hinzuweisen, wenn Sie nach der Veranstaltung gehen, dass Sie bitte die Headsets am Ausgang wieder abgeben. Nach dem Vortrag werden Lea Ypi und ich ein Gespräch führen. Das wird simultan Deutsch-Englisch sein mit wechselseitiger Übersetzung, aber Lea Ypi, Frau Ypi, ist des Deutschen auch gut mächtig, aber sie fühlt sich in der englischen Sprache doch eher zu Hause. Danach versuchen wir dann, wenn die Zeit es noch zulässt, auch das Publikum zu Wort kommen zu lassen. Und Lea Ypi hat sich bereit erklärt, auch nach Vortrag und Diskussion einige Exemplare ihres Buches zu signieren. Wenn Sie das tun wollen, dann gibt es nach dem Vortrag und der Diskussion dafür die Gelegenheit. Aber jetzt die Rednerin, die Hauptrednerin des heutigen Abends, Lea Ypi. Herzlich willkommen.
Thank you very much, everyone, for being here. Thank you for having me. I'll start with the epigraph of my new book, not with the exact sentence, but with one of the characters mentioned in the epigraph, and that is the poet Friedrich Schiller, whose famous lines, "Beautiful world, where are you?" you will remember from a poem called The Gods of Greece. And this was a poem that was written just before the French Revolution, and it's a kind of lament for lost harmony of classical Greece and an expression and longing for a time when human beings were reconciled with each other, where nature and spirit went along together, where the world was very different from the world in which Schiller lived. That was a world of alienation, as he describes it, where the gods have fled and have left humans to navigate their disenchantment. And Schiller's world is a world that is not so dissimilar from ours, which is also increasingly violent and fractured and marked by a loss of faith in humanity. But there is one difference. In Schiller's world, there was hope, if not real, at least imagined, and that hope came in the form of a belief in the redeeming power of art, in its capacity to mediate between feelings and moral imperatives. So the question my book raises, and that looms large behind it, is the question of where do we find reconciliation in the contemporary world? And I'm going to address this question by taking you on a journey from the utopia of classical Greek unity that Schiller describes in his poem to the dystopia of this new book project, which is the reimagining of, this should be showing at some point my, let's see if it comes at some point, which is a dystopia of a reimagining of a life of a woman, there we go, called Lea Ypi, was my grandmother, who was born in Salonika in 1918, a few years before the collapse of the Ottoman Empire, and died in Albania in 2006, a few years after the fall of communism. But before I outline and I explain what I try to do in that book and what the project is and how it relates to this Schillerian longing for unity, I'm going to read a little bit from the opening pages just so you get a sense of the voice of the book. And these are some of the some extracts from the pages that you have in front of you, and that's the very, very beginning of the book. I'm looking for the Secret Service archive, I say, as I approach the first taxi parked on Paris Commune, one of Tirana's bustling streets connecting the city center to its outer ring road. I hesitate to call it my street, even though it's been my home address in Albania for more than 20 years. Already when we moved to the capital during the transition from communism in the 90s, the question, "You're not from here, right?" came up with nagging regularity every time I struck up one of those casual conversations with strangers that seemed innocuous at first, but soon turned awkward. Most people returning to Tirana comment on how much it has changed. There are now more high-rise buildings, paved roads, cafes, bars, and cycle paths. Yet for me, it is a place of grief, guilt, and endless what-ifs. The longest stay I endured in the city was when my grandmother died, and I returned from my studies in Italy to organize the funeral. Alone in our kitchen during the obligatory 40 days of mourning, I struggled to accept that after decades of teaching me the importance of following rules, she'd vanished from my life without a word of warning. I had once told her that I would return to care for her, just as she'd cared for me throughout my childhood. It was now too late. I could no longer keep my promise. Tirana became the capital of remorse. I'm looking for the Authority for Information concerning documentation of the former State Security Service, I say, this time specifying the office in the same formal way it has introduced itself in the email inviting me to an appointment. The taxi driver seems not to hear me. A gray-haired man in his 70s, his face drawn-looking and hidden behind dark glasses, he wears a short-sleeved check shirt and a "Make America Great Again" red cap. Loud music blares from his car radio, tuned to Top Gold, a station that plays old classics. As I stand in front of the yellow Mercedes-Benz waiting for his response, I recognize the sound of Only You, struggling to drown out Lady Gaga's Just Dance from the taxi parked behind. He's not listening to the music, which has clearly been chosen to attract a certain kind of customer, but smoking and absorbed in a newspaper that covers the entire steering wheel. Sir, I'm looking for the Authority for Information Concerning Documentation of the former State Security Service, I repeat. I must sound worried, because my tone prompts the driver to finally look up, switch off the radio, toss the unfinished cigarette out of the window and turn to me with an expression of mild concern. Avash, Avash. Take it easy. Take a seat. Who's that you're looking for? Oh, I mutter, caught off guard by his failure to recognize my destination. I'm looking for the office with all the files. You know, the former Security Service archives. You want to go to the new office, right? The one they moved to recently. I shrug. Not sure, I reply, pulling out my phone to double-check the address. Dear Dr. Ypi, the email says, I'm writing regarding your request to access documentation from the former state security. Please bring an ID card with you, as it is required by the security protocol for entering the premises of the Skanderbeg military garrison, where the authority has recently relocated. I take my eyes off the screen. When the email first arrived, reading it made me shiver. Now I find reassurance in its formality. The fact that each time I check, the content remains unchanged. I particularly appreciate reviewing the names of family members, my grandmother, grandfather, and father, the way the list of people is offered to me like a meal deal, in a spirit of commercial detachment, which is just what I need at this stage. Nothing to feel emotional about, just a few details about a random group of people to whom I was assigned at birth, like discounted food items for the end-of-year festivities. I turn to the driver. I have here Unit 4, Skanderbeg Military Garrison. He nods with confidence. Yeah, that's the one. They moved there recently. There was some grant from the Swedish embassy or the Swedish government, or perhaps it was Denmark. One of them, the great powers. He raises his eyebrows, then a thought strikes him, and his tone shifts abruptly. It took those bastards 25 years to make the files accessible. Not the Swedes' fault, obviously. They have no idea. They just give the grant, tick a few boxes, done. I mean us, the Albanian side. Obviously, they were waiting for all the spies to die so they didn't have to punish anyone. He pauses to light another cigarette. Are you going there for work or for fun? To rescue my grandmother from the trolls, I think. To talk to her. To feel less guilty. To discover why she was smiling in the photograph, the one taken in the winter of 1941 in the depths of war, and to know if the smile was real. To find the truth or try to imagine it. To discover who betrayed her. To find the honeymoon photos. To write a book. To see if the past is already history or not quite yet. To see if nothing or everything has changed. Or perhaps simply I must go without knowing why. To make myself feel better or worse or the same. For fun, I say. End of reading. So this book starts with this photo, and this is the photo, which is this image that was posted on the Facebook wall of someone I had never met before and whose name I had also never heard of. And as you see in the photo, you have this young, glamorous-looking couple that stare at the camera, relaxing on sun loungers in front of a luxury hotel. And if you see here, it's not very easy to see, but in the photo that I had in front of me, at the very back you can see a pair of skis that are leaning against the wall. And you also see a packet of cigarettes on the table, and under it you see a paper bag, which on my zooming could show the name of a hotel that's called Hotel Vittoria. And looking at this photo, when I saw it on this Facebook wall, it didn't take very long to recognize my grandparents, Leman and Aslan. And judging by the winter clothing and the skis in the background and the name of the hotel, it was taken during their honeymoon in the Italian Alps in the Cortina d'Ampezzo in the winter of 1941. And my grandmother always spoke about this time of her life, these 10 days in the Dolomites, by saying she was the happiest person alive and that Cortina was the happiest place in the world. And already when she spoke about this, I wondered what she meant, because this was, after all, the winter of 1941. And there was Operation Barbarossa going on in the former Soviet Union. There was the attack on Pearl Harbor. There were ongoing battles in Yugoslavia, neighboring Albania. And all of this would have been making headlines when she was just learning to ski and learning to dance the waltz and relishing this winter air. And so I'd often wondered whether she was indifferent to this most brutal period and these most brutal battles of the most brutal war that humanity had ever known. And also wondered whether this was maybe one of those tricks that was reconstructed later in her memory, based not so much on what she had lived at the time, but on the trauma of what she had experienced later on. But unfortunately, even though I had all these doubts and mysteries, there was nothing left to search and nothing to find out, because I was always told that all our family records disappeared when the police came and took everything. So these were when my grandfather was arrested, as you'll see in a minute. So these were the kind of facts of her life that I knew at the point in which I came across this photo on social media. And I was really observing the photo and kind of thinking about this and thinking what I remembered about it. And I had almost forgotten to pay attention to the trolls that at some point started popping up on the screen as I was observing this photo. And people were saying, is this woman in the photo related to me, to Lea Ypi, the Marxist philosopher? And some people were saying she was a real lady. Some people said she was a spy, a communist spy, a fascist spy. Some people said she was both. And all of this trolling that was popping up on my screen kept making me think about something that she always said when she was alive, which was that there is something in the human spirit that withstands all the attempts at injury or humiliation or offense, and that's something that only humans are capable of, unlike other species, because they are the only species that can have thoughts that are disconnected from their immediate existence. And she said this kind of thing we call dignity. But of course, she was alive when she said all this, and she could speak for herself. When I was observing this photo, she was already long dead and condemned to silence while all these people were talking about her, her legacy, her life, and throwing mud on her and forming a kind of caricature version of her in a way that was stripped of memory or of context or of evidence. And so I felt kind of compelled to rectify, to go and find the truth about this photo and about this life, and somehow felt responsible for the legacy of this woman that I had known and I was very close to. And I could only think of one way forward, which was to find the truth by going to the source, which, as it happened, was this thing that I just started with, searching with the taxi driver, this place called the Authority for Information and Documentation Concerning the State Security Service. In other words, the archive where all the files of the Albanian Secret Service, surveillance files of the victims of communism in Albania are kept. So this was her file, and this is her in the winter of 1941, and the book is an effort to reconstruct this life based on two narrative voices, distinct temporal voices which are interspersed. So the first one is a first-person narrative in which I talk about the experience of searching for truth about my grandmother based on the surveillance files deposited in this archive by the spies that were following her throughout this communist period. And the perspective in this part of the book is an intergenerational perspective where the narrator, i.e. me, writes in the first person and juxtaposes findings in the archive with memories and reality with imagination. And the problem of dignity is closely connected to the search for truth. So the question is, you know, why was my grandmother placed under surveillance? What had she done to be placed under surveillance? Who spied on her? What reasons did they have? And what justifications did they give? And the reason behind this approach is that in many societies that are divided by the legacy of the past, there is a widespread belief that knowing the truth about what happened to someone during those communist years and knowing what exactly was done to families that experienced an oppressive system and which individuals, for example, collaborated to contribute to that oppression will finally restore the dignity of the victims. So the question of dignity is closely connected to the question of truth. And only after that has been done, only after we've uncovered what is in those files and in those archives, can the next generation begin the process of reconciliation. But as this part of the book shows, this only works if the archive works. And as it happens, the archive contains very little objective data, as I will go on to explain in a minute. So that's where the second person narrative becomes important. And from the second perspective, you tell the story of Leman's life, that is her as a young woman, from the fall of the Ottoman Empire to the fall of communism. And the voice is that of, in part, a sort of mystery novel, but also a family saga, which covers the political history of Europe in the years from the collapse of the Ottoman Empire to the fall of communism, and where you discuss this question around a life based on also reimagining and on fictionalized detail about the life of this person. So the main character on that second voice is also my grandmother, but the way in which the story is told is slightly different. And the main character of the book in both of them is this woman, Lea Ypi, who was born in Salonika in 1918. She's the granddaughter of an Ottoman pasha, so that's a high-ranking administrator elite in the Ottoman Empire. That is her great-grandfather, who was of Albanian origin. She grew up in Salonika. She was born to this Ottoman elite family, but at home everyone spoke French, as all aristocrats did in those days. And actually, even though she knew that she was of Albanian background, she had never visited Albania. And as it happens, in the year in which she was born, 1918, Albania wasn't even a state, because although it had declared independence from the Ottoman Empire in 1912, it was, in that particular year, annexed in the north by Serbia, in the south by Greece. France and Italy controlled a few scattered towns in the west, and Bulgaria and Austro-Hungary contended the rest. So it was a completely fragmented state. So she has this childhood in Salonika. This is an image of Salonika in the 1930s when she was growing up. She was, as a teenager, sent to study in the Lycée Français de Salonique, which was created by the Mission Laïque Française, where all the elites of Salonika went to studies, in a school with mostly Sephardic Jews, which at that point were the largest group in the city. And they had taught her to sing in Ladino and to smoke her first cigar. And only at the age of 20, she decided to go to Albania, which was by then an independent state fully, or at least was recognized as a fully independent state by the League of Nations, and where she became the first woman to work in the Albanian administration. And she was also the first woman very likely to propose marriage to a man. That was her husband, whom she met and she's here in a cafe in Tirana in 1930. This is my grandfather. His name is Aslan. He was a law graduate from the Sorbonne and a socialist sympathizer, but the son of a prominent Albanian collaborator and fascist. And he himself was a card-carrying socialist, but the tension between him and his father is also one of the subplots of the book. He sympathized with Leon Blum and campaigned for the Popular Front, and when he came to Albania, he was also involved in the anti-fascist underground movement in the 1940s. So then came the Albanian fascist occupation of Albania, the Nazi occupation of Albania, and in 1946 the war came to an end, and my grandmother finally took up Albanian citizenship and participated in the elections for the Constituent Assembly, which were the first elections in which women could vote, but also the last elections in which non-communist candidates could run for office. And shortly after those elections, within a few weeks, Aslan was arrested, charged for agitation and propaganda and collaboration with British intelligence officers during the war, and sentenced to 15 years in prison in this place, which is the Burrel, one of the famous prison sites in Albania, where he spent, as I say, 15 years, while at the same time a file on my grandmother was opened in the security service branch of the Interior Ministry of the Socialist People's Republic of Albania. And 3 times a year she visited her husband in prison. 4 times a year she was summoned by the secret services with an offer to become a collaborator and an informant. She was deported to the countryside. At that point was a single mother with a small child, was my father, her only child, and started working in labor camps. And this was more or less, this is kind of summary of her life, basically. So initially, I had thought about this project as a straight non-fictional book telling the facts of my grandmother's life as I came across them in these surveillance files of that I found. And the book would center on questions of state building in the nation and state building in the Balkans, discussing questions of individual and collective identity in the aftermath of the collapse of the Ottoman Empire, and in part looking at the changing dynamics of the interwar period. This is because this is a very interesting period, this interwar period, where the fall of the Ottoman Empire, but also the Habsburg and the Russian Empire, follows and shatters these old imperial identities and creates the need for new identities connected to these new rising nation states in the Balkans, and brings to the center of the debate the question of the definition of the self, the question of identity as connected to these nation state identities. And the idea was that I would observe all this and I would write about this as depending on what I found in the files, and would follow her story by reconstructing the facts of my grandmother's life that I found in the files. Now, when I started working on the book project, during my visits to the Secret Service archives, I came across several mistakes in the files. And I was kind of struggling to make sense of these mistakes. And the most puzzling of these mistakes was the fact that my grandmother was reported as a widow, which she was not because her husband was in prison, but also that her file was closed with a death certificate from 1953. And this made no sense because I had obviously lived with her. I was not born in 1953 and had known her, and she survived the end of communism. And so I was trying to understand why there was this death certificate, where did it come from? And it was only at that point that I was told that this is very common in the files, that sometimes you have these kind of big mistakes where sometimes Secret Service collaborators were under pressure, and so they just reported false information. Sometimes they omitted information out of sympathy with the people that they were following, and sometimes just invented stuff. And my mother, for example, had a slightly more sinister explanation, which was that maybe my grandmother had a cousin who had inserted a fake death certificate to try and save her from the persecution and from the surveillance from the Secret Service officers. Now, I'm not going to say which of these was the correct interpretation because it would be a massive plot spoiler, and that's part of the story in the book, but I will only say that the mistake could not be explained by the usual excuses that people gave when you went into the archives. And the broader point that I took away from this was that I had gone to the archives to find the truth about my grandmother, but actually discovered another interpretation, and with it another story. And this was, at first I thought, well, maybe this is just the Albanian archives, the communist archives, because I made up stuff and because of ideology and propaganda. But actually, the more archives outside Albania I added to my research, the more I discovered this problem occurring again and again. And began to realize that there is only a truth to find if you can trust the mechanisms through which that truth is transmitted. And that was not the case. So in Albania, as I said, I was told the spies were making up information. When I went to Greece, when she was born, to try and find evidence, I was told that the evidence around the Ottoman Empire and Ottoman Salonika had been destroyed in the subsequent waves of Hellenization and nationalization, Greek nationalism and Greek nationalization of the city, just so that, you know, the Greeks could pretend that only Greeks ever lived in Salonika and all these other minorities were not really relevant to the life of the city. In Italy, I was told, because a part of the story is in Cortina d'Ampezzo and has to do with Italian fascism and so on, I was told it's really hard to find records on women, and so on and so on. So in the end, the most interesting aspect of the search weren't the facts that one could find about my grandmother's life, but what one could tell about the world that led to the ruin of this life, so the reconstruction of the background historical context. And that's because both in Greece and in Albania, reconstructing her life in Salonika and in Tirana, one could see the devastating impact of the politics of the 1930s, right up to the start of World War II. And this was a politics of what was then called the unmixing of peoples. This was a famous phrase by Lord Curzon, where the multicultural coexistence of the empire was beginning to be destroyed and paved the way for the rise of nationalist movements, not too dissimilar from the nationalist anti-minority identitarian movements that we begin to see now in the present. It was also a world in which these international institutions that emerged from World War I, like the League of Nations, with the effort to promote cooperation between states and to promote global security and global peace, were also beginning to be dismantled as part of these deglobalization waves of the 1920s and 30s. It was a world in which the left progressively abandons internationalism, and the Spanish Civil War is the last time where the left is really international, is really unified and coming together, and becomes increasingly wedded to the nation state, both in its Stalinist version and in its social democratic version. And it was a politics in which the collapse of empires and the dismantling of this cosmopolitan world of the empire produced the minority question in international law. First as a question, then as a perceived threat, and then increasingly followed by this scapegoating of minorities of different ethnic or religious or cultural belonging, and then eventually all this degenerates into full-blown fascism. So to capture all of this, both the mysteries and the gaps and the facts that I came across in the files, and the absences, the silences of the archive, I thought about changing the method through which one can tell stories of this kind. So rather than writing just about the woman I know and knew, my grandmother, and chase only the known facts of her life or the things that I could find about her specifically, I thought that what my book would do was also try to give voice to all the silences of the archives. And since the information about my grandmother was sometimes highly reliable and sometimes completely off the mark, sometimes was about her and sometimes seemed to be about completely different people, I decided to include them by changing the method and by incorporating a way of telling a story that only literature is capable of. So why? Because many of the characters that I came across in these files or in the archives were characters with fragmented lives and often characters with no descendants. So their entire families had been persecuted or killed. And many of them had died without anyone that could record their lives or ask the question of their meaning, like I did after seeing my grandmother's Facebook photo. But I thought that those lives also deserved to be recorded somehow. And so I decided to kind of adopt all these other people that I met in the archive, to whom I was not related, and to also think about their dignity and what role memory plays in giving dignity to people, and who is in charge of reconstructing the mechanisms through which memory works. So instead of canceling all the characters that I had no relation to and immortalizing my grandmother, whom I did have a relation to, I decided to adopt everyone, more or less, and to bring to the rest of the book the same blurring of facts and fiction that I came across in the archive. and to make the reader experience the same feeling of deception and manipulation that I felt when I encountered those archives for the first time. And the same sort of sense of disorientation that I experienced when I experienced this confusion about my grandmother's life. So rather than having to choose whether the book is more history or more literature, I thought I would use the incidents to have not only the reconstruction of the facts of my grandmother's life and the story of her life, but also a meta-narrative on how to tell such stories in the absence of the full evidence. And so explicitly thematize this question of the continuity of history in literature and of literature in history. So this will now take me back to, and this is a method as my grandmother and me, as a granddaughter, and the life reimagined is the abstraction and the artwork and the author and the writer who thinks and imagines a life. But this takes me back to the central question with which I started, which is the possibility of engaging and learning from the past under conditions of uncertain truth and legacy. And here my dilemma is the same as Schiller's dilemma. So Schiller says, all improvement in the political sphere must come from the elevation of character. But how can we elevate character if we live in divisive politics, if we live in an unjust world, he asks in the letters for the aesthetic education of humanity. And the modern world that we live in is very much like Schiller's world, is the same kind of disenchantment, the same sort of friendlessness, and it's also a world that is marked by conflict and by polarization. So how do we answer that question that Schiller answers about reconciliation and about finding harmony again in this divided world? So Schiller says, we can't expect reconciliation with the help of politics, because politics is what brought us here. This is why we find ourselves in this place. And if we only rely on the facts of the archive, all we find is layers and layers of manipulation by political elites and of deception and of exercise of power. So what is the alternative? Where do we find hope? And Schiller's suggestion was to turn to art, to the power of imagination in reorienting human beings towards certain moral way of telling stories. And their reconciliation isn't really about finding the end of a process, reaching the end of a process, but really about finding a mechanism through which you can engage with the conflicts of the present. And so it's not really about what truth you find from the past, but what kind of relations with other humans you construct as you're looking for that truth that you know to be fraught and fragmented and fallible. And so Schiller says the instrument of education is art, because art, he says, is free from everything that is positive or established by human convention and rejoices in the kind of immunity from this human lawlessness. And so art, rather than politics, can bring reconciliation because, as Schiller says, and I quote, the political legislator can enclose the territory of the artist, but they can't completely govern it. So they can limit it, but they can't completely rule it. They can prescribe the friends of truth, but they can't endure the truth. And they can humiliate the artist, but they can't debase art itself, end of quote. So Schiller's message seems to be that reflecting on past injustice and on the dignity of the dead isn't so much about reconstructing the truth about a life that was already there and given to us and that is possible to reconstruct from these facts, but rather finding different perspectives from which to understand a truth of our time and also from which to see how history repeats itself in certain circumstances. And so in this creation of multiple perspectives where you kind of try to wrestle the self from manipulation and from ideology and propaganda, you can reconstruct an imaginary life, and you can reconstruct it from a moral point of view by thinking not so much about just the historical records that you find, but by thinking about the interpretation of these historical records. And that's because, and you can do that with the help of literature and art, because what art enables you to do is to enter the minds of all these different characters that lived in this very different time that was completely far and distant from us, and yet to question their motives and to ask yourself, what would you do in their position? How would you identify with them and build the sort of mechanisms of empathy that only literature can give you and history is unable to do because it only relies on given data. And so this is this kind of combination of micro and macro, of facts on the one hand and fiction on the other, that help us understand not just the abstract patterns and just abstract forces of law and history, but also how events can escalate and how things get out of control and how these very small, seemingly irrelevant decisions can then lead into bigger decisions that make an entire world degenerate until it's too late. So this is what the book tries to establish from a philosophical perspective, that dignity isn't something that we find out there or that politics can give us. It's something that consists in an effort to preserve one's moral character, as some of my characters in the book do, even when they live in a world that doesn't reflect that moral character and in fact tries to go and undermine those moral imperatives and actively conspires against them. And that's what literature does, perhaps better than philosophy and better than history, is to give a place to the imagination alongside the moral and the political imperatives of reason. And when that is done, the past no longer conditions us, as it does if we just take the authority of the files as the authority of truth over truth, but rather helps us understand with the eyes of a future that you want to avoid or a future that you want to kind of recreate, a kind of counterfactual future that you think about by linking it to this past that has already been and somehow shows us some of the patterns of the present. So I think that's why Schiller ends in his famous poem with lost harmony and where he laments lost harmony and authenticity by saying that exiled gods now only live in the creation of the poets. So in the end, these are really my final words, in the end, to answer the question of how you can reconstruct someone's dignity, the answer is to turn to art and to the power of imagination in reorienting human beings, as Schiller said, towards the moral. And therefore, my question is, well, did it really ever matter who exactly my grandmother was or who exactly my grandmother is? She is a generic character. She's half real, half fictional, half existent, half constructed. She's a real presence and an influence in my life, but she's also the product of a writer's imagination. And she's a particular human being that tries, through the work of literature, to connect all the other human beings out there to a kind of universal of humanity that lives in all of them. And reconciliation, therefore, is not really about reaching the end of a process, but finding a way to engage with the conflicts of the present. And it's not really about the truth that one finds, but more about the relations that you build with other humans, as I said, as you look for that truth. And so if that's the case, the story with which I started, the story of this grandmother's life, is only in part in the facts of her life and in the reconstruction of the facts around that life, because just as valuable is the interpretation of these facts, the voices they bring to life, the silences they fill, the gaps they animate, and in the end, the sort of moral light that they shed on the world. And so the kind of catharsis that we get from this operation is a catharsis that doesn't depend on closure or on full closure with the past, but is rather a kind of catharsis that is encouraged by reflection on how things could be different. And that's why there is only one sentence in my book in which the word indignity, that is the title of the English edition, occurs, and that is indignity that is challenged and defied and fought over with the help of imagination. So, thank you.
Ja, ganz herzlichen Dank, liebe Lea Ypi. Das Buch ist kein einfaches Buch. Das Buch ist komplex, es ist vielschichtig, es hat viele Schichten. Und du hast gerade noch mal deutlich gemacht, glaube ich, dass es notwendig war, diese vielen Schichten in diesem Buch zu berücksichtigen, weil der Gang des Schreibens ja eigentlich nicht vorhersehbar war, sondern weil der Gang des Schreibens durch Irritation und auch durch eine gewisse Vergeblichkeit bezogen auf das eigentliche Ansinnen, den Beginn, gekennzeichnet ist. Wenn ich das richtig verstehe, ging es ja darum, dass die eigene Vorstellung zunächst diejenige war, durch eine historische Rekonstruktion, durch die Befragung der Archive, Wahrheit über deine Großmutter zu erzielen. Aber die Archive lügen, sie trügen, sie stellen Dinge unrichtig dar. Und wir wollen jetzt auch den Spoiler nicht verraten, also nicht aufschließen und aufklären, das hast du ja auch nicht getan. Es gibt eine ganz überraschende Wendung am Ende des Buches. Und danach ist eigentlich die Vergeblichkeit der Unternehmung, historische Rekonstruktion durch die Archive zu erlangen, eigentlich ganz deutlich. Im Prinzip muss man sagen, man scheitert. Man scheitert, wenn man versucht, über die Archive die Geschichte zu rekonstruieren. Das ist eine ganz elementare Erkenntnis, die man befragen muss auf ihre Allgemeingültigkeit, weil natürlich vieles davon abhängt, was man über die geschichtswissenschaftliche Rekonstruktion von autoritären Regimen über Archive bekommen kann. Das ist sozusagen die eine Schicht. Und dass wir vielleicht zunächst einmal darüber reden, auch sozusagen als Autorin. Du hast das ja auch deutlich gemacht, du hast gesagt, ich habe mir eine Vorgehensweise geändert. Ich habe sozusagen jetzt anders geschrieben. Wie ist das, wenn man als Autorin mit so einem Vorsatz beginnt, auch als Wissenschaftlerin? Das ist ja auch nochmal sozusagen eine zusätzliche Komplikation, wenn man an solch ein Thema geht. Und dann stellt man fest, es funktioniert nicht. Ich meine, das Scheitern in der Wissenschaft ist Alltag. Wir haben immer sozusagen ein Vorhaben und dann werden wir irgendwie an die Grenzen unserer eigenen Erkenntnisfähigkeit gebracht. Insofern ist das sozusagen mit dem Geschäft der Wissenschaftlerin ja vereinbar. Aber wie ist das, wenn man sowas schreibt? Und du hast ja auch sehr schnell geschrieben. Also ich meine, das Buch ist innerhalb weniger Zeit oder Jahre, es sind 2 Jahre, 3 Jahre, 2 Jahre, wenn man mal den Prozess des Lektorierens auch noch mit und der Veröffentlichung und so weiter mit einbezieht. Innerhalb von 2 Jahren die Recherche und das Schreiben, das ist eine unglaubliche Leistung, finde ich. Aber wie ist das? Wie bist du damit umgegangen, als du gemerkt hast, es funktioniert so nicht? Du hast gesagt, du hast es anders gemacht, aber das ist ja auch eine Frustration.
Yeah, so I think maybe it's helpful to talk about the beginning of this process. At the very beginning, when I started thinking about the archives and entering the archives, I was already confronted with the question of how I would approach the files. And this is from the very moment where you get sent this request, you have to fill a form in which you say, do you access the file as a family member or as a researcher? So this was already the first moment of having to make the decision, and I had applied as a researcher because I was very aware of the stories, including from the GDR, of people who go to the archive finding or trying to find the truth about a family member that they think is a hero, and trying to find the perpetrators and reconstruct a victim story. And then they go to the archive and they discover that the person that they thought was a hero turns out to be a collaborator who has also ruined other people's life. And so I was very mindful of the fact that in an oppressive system, there aren't clear innocent and wrongdoers. There is always a gray area where someone is complicit or someone who is a bystander contributes to a larger harm. And to somehow relieve myself from this burden of the family in the archive, I had applied as a researcher. And with this, I was giving myself already a little bit of leeway in thinking about what is this project going to be for me. But it still was a project that was going to be mainly about the archive and the files and a reconstruction of just the files. What it was not at the beginning was a meta-reflection of what of the Lügen, of the lies of the archive. And some of them aren't even necessarily lies. They are just lies to you in connection to this particular person that you're searching for. You know, if the archive says, as it said about my grandmother, that she was dead in 1953, or that she never had a husband, or there are ways in which you can normalize the lies, but you can't get away from the fact that the archive is just simply telling you an untrue story about this person. And this lie of the archive made me start thinking about the boundary between truth and lies and imagination and reality. Because, you know, if you remember Plato in the Republic, where he talks about the artists, he says the artists are terrible and should be banned from the city because they make copies of the world, and so they're 1 degree removed from the ideal. And I thought, well, if you think of this archive actually as also a creation and also very far removed from the idea, and if you think about how these spies are building information, they're literally interfering with the files in a creative way as well. I mean, they're not just lying, they're actually aesthetically doing some operation with these files. They're ordering them in a certain way and so on. Then you ask yourself, now there's an authority here, that there's a kind of creative authority. And the question is, what is the authenticity? What is the standpoint of this creative authority? And it seemed to me that the authority of the state and of all these political institutions is always the authority of power. It's power that is trying to tell a story about itself and constructing the evidence in such a way that the evidence confirms the story that they want you to know about them. And I mean, as I said, this wasn't just the case in Albania. In Greece, it was the same. You go to the Ottoman archives and you discover that the Greek nation state, the Greek nationalism, has completely manipulated the files and interfered and told you a story as well. So for me, then the question became, what are the mechanisms through which a researcher can both raise awareness about this is what the facts are doing to us, this is this power, this is this authority that is creating the files, and what is the standpoint from which we can reconquer, reappropriate some form of authenticity, or at least a moral standpoint in asking the question. And I think somehow, this is why I ended up with Schiller, because I thought, well, Schiller gives you this perspective on art which is very different from the Plato on the artist, which is actually the artist is much closer to the ideal world than the artist. He's not making copies, it's actually giving you a symbol of the morally good. And then the book became this way of trying, in the way of telling the story, of showing its own method. And you're right, it was very frustrating for me, but the same frustration that I experienced is now being sent to the readers, and I think it's a very frustrating read for a lot of readers as well, because they get to the end and they're like, what did I read?
Ja, ich möchte nachher sozusagen auf die Fiktion und den Schiller eingehen, aber vielleicht ganz am Schluss. Ich will das nochmal aufgreifen, die Vergeblichkeit, die Frustration, die mit der Suche über die Archive verbunden war. Einerseits, das sagst du ja auch sehr deutlich, die Macht der Archive ist groß, es geht um Macht. Sie strukturiert unsere Wahrnehmung, auch sozusagen die Aufarbeitung der Vergangenheit. Jetzt ist für mich als Wissenschaftler, als Politikwissenschaftler, aber vielleicht auch viele Geschichtswissenschaftlerinnen die Frage ja drängend, wie mache ich dann Aufarbeitung? Ich meine, wir haben das in der DDR, in Ostdeutschland, in Deutschland mit den Stasi-Akten. Einerseits muss man auf die Stasi-Akten zurückgreifen, um das Leben oder Beziehungen des Verrates, der Unwahrheit, der Entwürdigung zu rekonstruieren. Und andererseits, so sagst du sehr deutlich, und so macht das Buch das auch deutlich, größte Vorsicht. Da sind so viele Lügen, so viele Irrwege drin. Und manchmal, hier am Schluss, aber ich verrate es dann doch nicht, wird dermaßen gelogen, dass man an allem zweifelt. So, das bedeutet aber jetzt die Unmöglichkeit von Aufarbeitung. Und das ist natürlich für Historikerinnen, für Politologen, aber auch für den öffentlichen Diskurs desaströs. Wir können gar nicht damit umgehen. Oder? Wo sind die Wege? Ohne jetzt, sag mal, die Imagination wieder einzuführen oder die Fiktionalisierung. Das würde ich erstmal noch beiseite lassen, sozusagen von Wissenschaftler zu Wissenschaftlerin, weil wir, glaube ich, auch schuldig sind, oder du bist auch vielleicht die Antwort auf diese Frage schuldig gegenüber der Disziplin, die sich damit auseinandersetzt.
Yeah, I think, I don't think there is an easy answer to that question. I think it is, in some ways, it is about abandoning the worshipping of the facts. So a part of this effort is to say, we just have to work with these gray zones and with these gray areas. And that doesn't mean for me saying, okay, then I forget about the facts because they're not relevant at all. They're all lies and therefore I don't need to know. I think the lies also tell you something about an era, but they tell you something in a way that is more mediated and more complicated than just this very simple approach of I go there and I see what they tell me and I do the Aufarbeiten with that. I think there is a kind of reconciliation that comes from understanding gaps and also from constantly asking you this question of power, not just in the power of the archive, but also in the power of the present. And I think I'm really interested when I think about questions of reconciliation in thinking about historical injustice, not just as historical injustice, but as injustice that is carried over in the present, because a lot of these structures and a lot of these mechanisms of complicity and compliance and allegiance to problematic systems, we know this, I'm sure Dresden is the right place to talk about this, but a lot of this survives even when the era is over institutionally. So, and somehow I think being much more aware of this and approaching the facts in a way that raises awareness about this problem is better at reconciliation and better at doing the kind of Aufarbeiten than just starting with this, I think, somewhat naive approach that the facts give you what they need. And in my case, what this takes, the form that this takes is to say, you don't have to be just interested in your family. You don't have to be just interested in what this tells you about you and about your perspective. You have to pluralize the approach and you have to pluralize the ways in which you look at it, the method through which you approach it, and then you will have a different relationship to the data if you pluralize it. And I think, you don't want to go there, but I do think that literature and art is a part of that process. It's not some afterthought that comes, that to the extent that you get some authenticity, it comes from these perspectives working together without one necessarily reducing the other.
Ich will es noch mal ein bisschen weiter pointieren. Das würde ja bedeuten, dass man sozusagen über die Literatur individuelle Geschichten erzählt, über diese Zeit. Aber wir brauchen sozusagen für den politischen Diskurshaushalt, brauchen wir auch Strategien, wie man eben mit autoritären, diktatorischen Regimen umgeht. Denn dann könnte man ganz schnell sagen, so wie das für die Bundesrepublik Deutschland in den 50er Jahren und 60er Jahren beispielsweise mal Hermann Lübbe gesagt hat, man beschweigt sozusagen die Nazi-Vergangenheit, weil man kann sie sowieso nicht so rekonstruieren, wie sie eigentlich war. So, dann müsste man sich entweder zurückhalten, gar nichts mehr sagen, oder aber man macht sozusagen individuelle Geschichten, wie man versucht hat, so einigermaßen heil durch die Diktatur und den Nationalsozialismus zu kommen. Reicht das sozusagen für den öffentlichen Haushalt des Diskurses?
Again, I don't think it suffices, or I don't think it's enough by itself. So I think if you then only individualize it, then it's also a problem. This is why my work, my method is dialectical, and this is why I always say to people who tell me, what is the book in the end? Is it more fact, or is it fictional, or is it non-fictional? And I say, well, I don't want to answer this question, because I think what literature does is, I think you're right, although it is about individuals, and it is about individual stories, it tells you a story about how individuals live moral dilemmas that makes you understand a lot better and identify with how characters lived in a time that is very different from yours. So while the more historical and the more sort of, well, let's call it historical, the more abstract, philosophical, historical approach makes you see an era from the outside and think about the era as something that's in the past, and the people who worked are people of the past and they have nothing to do with us. What literature does, because it plugs you into individual stories and it makes you see these characters with their individual dilemmas, you could see that you could be that character as well. And actually from a novelist's perspective, this is very interesting, because I noticed this when I move in my work from writing philosophy to writing literature. If you write literature, you have to identify with every character, otherwise it's not a good story, it's horrible. And so when I write characters, I have to identify with every character, and there is a character in my book who is a Nazi, and you have to identify with a Nazi to write a convincing character. Otherwise, it looks like you're condemning him even before he has a chance. So you have to have somehow empathy from these, even really these problematic characters. And in doing so, it's almost like, I think, it's as if literature somehow shows you democracy in the work, because you have this debate that goes on between the characters, and the author is embodying each of these perspectives and entering the point of view of each of these characters and living with the dilemmas of that character and making decisions based on worldviews, but still individual decisions. And I think in that sense, literature helps you understand the continuity of the past in the present much more than these alternative approaches, because it has this mechanism of identification that, of course, starts with an author, but then the better the work is, the more it continues with the reader. Then the reader also read it and think, okay, I can now also see why he was thinking like this, or why he did this, or why he ended up making those choices, and you also see yourself, and that's actually where the catharsis really rests.
Das heißt eigentlich auch, dass, wenn ich das auch wieder ein bisschen zuspitze, es gibt einen Shift sozusagen in deinem eigenen Approach. Du sagst, weg sozusagen von der wissenschaftlichen Rekonstruktion hin, auch zu den Modi der Fiktionalität von Literatur. Und manches ist ja auch so geschrieben, als wenn sie dabei gewesen wäre. Die Illusion der Anwesenheit spielt eine große Rolle. Was ja ein ganz anderes Prinzip ist als das, was man sozusagen in der Wissenschaft betreibt. Würdest du jetzt sagen, du bist eigentlich eine Schriftstellerin hier und verlässt gänzlich sozusagen den Bereich der Wissenschaft? Oder würdest du sagen, das ist eine besondere Form eigentlich, die Fiktionalität mit den Fakten zusammenzubinden, wo man aber manchmal eben nicht weiß, sozusagen, was Faktum ist und was Fiktion ist. Und wenn der Leser dann auch sozusagen die ganze Zeit sozusagen auf diesen beiden Strängen, den beiden Gleisen entlanggeführt wird, auch Dokumente werden ja eingeführt und abgedruckt, und dann am Ende kommt sozusagen nochmal die ganz große Enttäuschung her, dann weiß man als Leser nicht mehr, damit umzugehen. Ich sage, man kann schon damit umgehen, aber man staunt sozusagen am Ende, wo kommt sie jetzt eigentlich raus? Was ist sozusagen die Conclusio? Also die Frage ist zweigeteilt. Einmal das Erstaunen darüber, dass man eigentlich aus dem Buch ein bisschen ratlos herausgeht. Und andererseits eben auch die Frage, das Verhältnis von Fakten und Fiktion, von Wissenschaft und Schriftstellerin. Das würde ich ganz gerne nochmal problematisieren.
Yeah, I think so. When one takes this radical conclusion of the book really on board, the point of it is to ask yourself, well, there's two reactions. One is to say, what did I read? But the other one, which is the one that I hope people will take away, is to ask themselves, what world do I live in? And so to actually ask yourself, can I trust the difference between facts and fiction in the world in which I live? And can I really trust the authorities that tell me, you know, now you're reading a story, now you interpret the story in this way, now. So it seems to me that what literature does when it does this profoundly disrupting and sort of, I think disturbing also effect, I think it has this disturbing effect on a lot of people that they just, you know, they complete disorientation. And my point is that that complete disorientation could well be the disorientation of the world in which we live, where you might well be living in someone's fiction. And this is, I think, the work of philosophy at its most radical, where it forces you to not take anything for granted. And of course, here it does it with the method of fiction, but I think that's what literature does also, and that's also why literature flourishes even in totalitarian societies, because precisely because it has this capacity to kind of make you ask these radical questions of who you are, what world you live in, how you relate to power and authority in your own time. It can be about remote times and remote places, and yet it has this disquieting effect. And I mean, it's really interesting. I always think of the example of the Albanian writer Ismail Kadare, who writes about, he writes about Ottoman Empire, people's dreams being collected in the Ottoman Empire. And you read this book, and it was written in communist Albania, and it's so obviously about communist Albania, and yet it manages to survive censorship, and the guy never gets sent to prison, unlike a lot of other, because that's what art, and this is where I think Schiller was going, where he says you can confine, but you can't dominate the territory of art, and that's what it does when it's sort of taken at its most radical. I guess what I was trying to do in the book was to just show the method through which art does that, and so that's why it's in some ways even more disturbing, because while a lot of art does it by just saying it's fiction, in this case you're really pressing on the question of the boundary between fiction and reality.
Wenn wir das jetzt so auseinandernehmen, heißt das nicht, dass man nicht mit allerhöchster Spannung dieses Buch liest. Es ist ja eben auch ein Mystery Novel, das heißt, man ist als Leser genauso wie die Autorin daran interessiert zu wissen, wie es wirklich ist. Die Suche nach der Wahrheit, und das wäre jetzt auch nochmal ein anderer Punkt, das Buch hat ja auch, und du hast das auch hier deutlich gemacht in deiner Erläuterung, noch so eine Meta-Ebene. Die Meta-Ebene besteht darin, dass man die Wahrheit haben will. Mit der Suche nach der Wahrheit ist aber auch die Suche und den Wegen nach Versöhnung möglich oder aufgegeben. Und diese Versöhnung wird stark gemacht und wir kommen am Ende aber nicht zu einem wirklichen Resultat. Weil wir die Wahrheit nicht finden, müssen wir sozusagen der Wahrheit auch entraten. Und unser Bedürfnis sozusagen, uns über die Akteure, die Personen, die Charaktere vorführen zu lassen, wie Würde sozusagen auch in Diktaturen erhalten bleibt oder wie man Würde wiederherstellen kann, um da auf diesen Weg sozusagen zu einem Akt der Versöhnung zu kommen, das bleibt am Ende meines Erachtens offen. Das kann ja sozusagen auch ein literarisches Prinzip sein. Es ist auch ein wissenschaftliches Prinzip, sozusagen nicht immer die Lösung vorzuführen, sondern die Frage offen zu lassen, um sozusagen den Leser dazu zu zwingen, über diese komplexen Zusammenhänge nachzudenken. Aber wenn man sozusagen diese Meta-Ebene noch sieht, die das Buch ja deutlich hat, und man kommt am Ende eben zum Ergebnis, da ist keine Versöhnung möglich, es ist auch keine Wahrheit möglich, dann warst du selbst enttäuscht, sozusagen, dass du das nicht gefunden hast, was du gesucht hast. Soll der Leser enttäuscht zurückbleiben? Oder hast du eine Antwort?
Well, I think I found a higher truth. So I don't think I found the truth about my grandmother, but I found a truth of a period through this method. And that's because by incorporating in my story all these other characters that I would otherwise have to exclude, I could tell a much more complete narrative of what happened in Salonika when the Ottoman Empire collapsed. What did the population exchange between Greece and Turkey do to minorities? What did the rising nationalism do? How did they suffer from the financial crisis? If I had only tried to find the truth about my family, I would have just given up on some of these things because, for example, I knew that the family suffered from the financial crisis, but I didn't know exactly the mechanisms through which they did it. And so then I started searching for other characters that were coming up in the files and in the historical research. And through these other characters, I could see, what was the effect of the trade routes with the Ottoman Empire being disrupted, and how did it affect Salonika, and what did the changes from Ottoman administration to Greek administration do to these businesses. So I didn't find the truth about my family, but I found a lot of other families out there that I could read about, and in reading what happened to them, and they were in a similar social position, similar status, ranking, characters quite similar, I could see roughly how things went in this period. And then I could go back to the individual and think, okay, what did my grandmother make of this? And the individual I knew because I had this personal connection to her. And so it was this combination of, as I say, the imagination and the work of imagination, which was also based on historical reconstruction. It's not that I invented, when I say there was a tobacco business between Ottoman Empire and Salonika and that was disrupted and there's a tobacco trader, all of that is based on historical research. It's just that it was not necessarily about the specific characters that I had set out to research. It was about these other characters that either I would have to exclude, or with this different method I could include and come to a richer understanding of reconciliation. So I think the question is for me, what is reconciliation and who is reconciled with what? I don't think, did I get reconciled with my grandmother's past specifically? I don't think so. But in understanding the world in which she lived, in understanding the broader forces that shaped her life, I think I was reconciled with something bigger, actually, that was an understanding of an era. And also, I could see the parallels between this period and the period in which we live, and started asking myself, well, maybe we now live in a world of scapegoating of minorities and disruption of cosmopolitan existence and multiculturalism. So that had something also to do with reconciliation, not as something about the past, but actually something looking towards the future. And it became the past seen from the eyes of a future rather than just with the elements that the past offers you.
Ich frage mich, hast du die Wahrheit über deine Großmutter herausgefunden? Die Frage war ja am Anfang, ist sie eine Spionin oder nicht? Mhm. Oder wie kommt dieses fürchterlich fröhlich aussehende Bild aus Cortina d'Ampezzo von 1941 war es? Wie kommt das zustande, wo eigentlich die Welt sozusagen in Flammen stand? So, wie kann das sein? Also das waren ja für dich sozusagen Momente, wo das Nachdenken anfing, das Staunen anfing und jetzt sozusagen der Erkenntnisdrang dich beflügelte, sich damit zu befassen. Und gleichzeitig ging es ja auch darum, die Würde der Großmutter zu retten gegenüber den Trolls in den Social Media. So, wissen wir am Ende, ich habe mich gefragt, weiß Lea Ypi jetzt, ob ihre Großmutter, pardon, vielleicht doch in der einen oder anderen Weise Zuträgerdienste für wen auch immer geleistet hat, das wird ja nicht klar, sondern durch das Dokument, was du am Schluss ja abdruckst, wird nur sozusagen die Lüge aufgetischt, dass sie womöglich ja viel früher schon gestorben sei. Was sozusagen die Sache nochmal eine ganz besondere Wendung gibt hier. Da kommt man ja auf die Idee, haha, dann ist vielleicht deine Großmutter, die du kennengelernt hast, gar nicht die Person, von der du glaubst, dass sie die Großmutter ist. Nicht? Dass das sozusagen noch eine zweite Person ist. Gut, jetzt erzähle ich nicht weiter, sonst ist die Geschichte dann doch aufgelöst. Aber da hast du doch und der Leser nach wie vor ganz große Fragen, die jetzt sozusagen nur durch Imagination, aber vielleicht auch durch sozusagen den Versuch, eine plausible Geschichte über die Mutter zu erzählen, überbrückt wird. Oder sehe ich das verkehrt?
Yeah, so my initial question was my grandmother a spy or not? And my final answer is, she could have been, but there is you can't tell. So I think the point, and that's not, I could say what I found and whether I found that she was a spy or she was not a spy, but the point is that that question is no longer relevant at the end. Because the question at the beginning is, was my grandmother a spy or not? The question at the end that the book has answered is, what is the mechanism by which someone like my grandmother could have been a spy in a system that emerged in this way? And that question, she could have been a spy, and I could have been a spy if I had been like her. And then the question is, at what point did she have decision, where was there moral agency in this? Was there at any point moral agency? And then comes the artist, the authors, the literature perspective, which tries to show you the moments where, even with all the constraints, someone had moral agency. So yes, she could have been a spy, but then there were also moments where she said no, and she didn't become a spy. And the reader reads this and thinks about the way they make moral decisions, the way they make compromises in their life, the way they think about the present. And it's not the question of, is Lea Ypi's grandmother a spy or not? It's a question of what is the world in which I have to live so that these dilemmas are more and more resolved and that I'm not forced to make these choices.
Ich würde jetzt gerne noch die andere Schicht, weil das Buch ist wirklich vielschichtig und je länger man sich damit befasst, desto mehr Fragen bekommt man auch, was einfach toll ist. Das ist kein Buch, was am Anfang ein Rätsel hat und am Ende das auflöst. Insofern ist es kein einfacher Krimi, obwohl es zum Teil ja auch solche Elemente von Kriminalsuche oder Kriminaldienst enthält. Das war auch in dem Prolog, ich gucke mir die Archive an und versuche das rauszukriegen. Was mich auch heute und vielleicht am Buch irritiert und worüber ich viel nachdenke, ist die Antwort, die Wahrheit liegt in der Kunst. Mit Schiller, die Wahrheit, the truth lies with the art. So, ist in die Art. Also die Schiller-Antwort. Dass die Kunst, die Imagination, die Literatur, dass sie eigentlich die Antworten auf die großen Fragen gibt. Mhm. Und das kombiniert auch sozusagen mit der These, die Würde liegt darin, dass man das Richtige tut unter den gegebenen Umständen. Das ist ja, glaube ich, der Grundsatz, den du auch von deiner Großmutter übernommen hast. Würde ist, dass man in bestimmten Situationen das Richtige tut. Das ist ja wenn ich mir das so zurechtlege, eine Antwort, wenn die Antwort eben in der Kunst oder in der Literatur liegt, sehr, sehr stark bildungsbürgerlich, sehr stark dem deutschen Idealismus auch entspricht. Wenn man mit Schiller kommt und sozusagen mit Schiller die Frage stellt, wie man die Entzweiung und die großen Verzweiflungen der Welt löst und sagt, ja, sie liegt dann aber in der Kunst, dann ist das eine Antwort, die man übrigens in Dresden sehr gerne hört, weil im Heiligtume der Kunst, wie das in den staatlichen Kunstsammlungen heißt, ich glaube im Semperbau steht das ja, willkommen im Heiligtume der Kunst, sozusagen die Kunstreligion, sozusagen auch ein Glaubensersatz ist und die Wahrheit sich in der Kunst offenbart. Aber das sind sozusagen Modi der Epiphanie. Das ist ein ganz anderes Verhältnis eigentlich auch zur Wahrheit, welches sich durch Bilder zum Ausdruck bringt. Dann ist das etwas, was auch bei Telkamp, ich nehme jetzt Telkamp, ein in Dresden und darüber hinaus ja umstrittener Autor, aber im gleichen Verlag wie du auch, Uwe Telkamp, mit dem Turm. Das heißt, da gibt es sozusagen ein Nischenbürgertum. Die Welt um einen herum, also die harte DDR-Zeit, wird ein bisschen verdrängt. Man ergeht sich in Literatur, man ergeht sich in Musik, das wird alles dargestellt. Das Bürgertum um sich herum als Nische im DDR-Sozialismus baut sozusagen eine Mauer, um sich sozusagen ein anständiges und vielleicht auch moralisch wertvolles Leben zu bereiten. Das ist eine, würde ich sagen, unpolitische Variante. Das ist etwas, was sozusagen in der Innerlichkeit des Bürgers, der Bürgerin liegt, in einem bildungsbürgerlichen Kontext. Und das ist auch so ein bisschen das, was Peter Djelavic in seinem Buch über Kunstfreiheit sagt, das ist deutsche Ideologie, weil man sozusagen der Politik sozusagen einen Abwehrreflex gegenüber Politik hat. Man ist angewidert von der Politik und zieht sich zurück sozusagen in die Kunst, in die Kultur, in die Literatur und kann da ein reines Leben führen. Insofern ist auch dein Abschied sozusagen von der Politik, die Politik gibt keine Lösung oder gibt keine Heilung oder kann nicht versöhnen, keine Rekonziliation geben hier, sondern das kann eigentlich nur die Fiktionalität von Kunst und von Literatur tun. Das ist eine Problem, finde ich, im deutschen Kontext eine sehr ehrenwerte, auf den klassischen Idealismus zurückgreifende Lösung, aber es ist auch eine problematische, weil sozusagen die private Innerlichkeit so stark macht und mit Pathos auch auflöst, aber sozusagen die Politik außen vor ist. Und das ist historisch gesehen, ist das so gewesen, wenn man sich das 19. Jahrhundert anguckt. Die gescheiterten deutschen Revolutionen führten immer dazu, dass sich die Bildungsbürgerinnen und Bildungsbürger zurückzogen sozusagen auf die Musik, spielt eine große Rolle, auf die Literatur, auf Lyrik. Das spielte eine große Rolle und deshalb kommst du ja auch mit Schiller, weil er sozusagen ein Angebot hat, was die Politik, die böse Welt, nicht bereithält. Also die Erlösung liegt sozusagen in der Literatur, in der Kunst und die mache ich mit mir aus sozusagen. Und dieser Weg der Verinnerlichung ist auch ein Weg der Privatisierung, ist also auch in einem klassisch politiktheoretischen Konzept unpolitisch, wäre zum Beispiel für Athen, für die Polis nicht tragbar gewesen, wenn man sich so weit zurückzieht. Also hier sehe ich ein echtes Problem, was du uns anbietest, worüber man natürlich nachdenkt, was auch seine reale Substanz und Substrat hat, aber es ist auch für die gegenwärtige Situation vielleicht doch nicht der einzige Weg, damit umzugehen. Wenn die Welt im Augenblick wieder aus den Fugen geraten ist, wenn die Welt sozusagen eigentlich den kämpferischen Einsatz jetzt braucht, um das an Freiheit zu erhalten, was uns so lieb geworden ist, was wir brauchen auch sozusagen, um auch unzensurierte Literatur zu lesen, dann ist sozusagen der Ansatz, guckt doch in die Literatur, beschäftigt euch mit Schiller, ist dann nicht ausreichend.
I think you're right and wrong. I think you're right if we see art as fully separate and sort of trying to carve a path for itself, and the artist as trying to carve a path from itself that is fully independent from the political. And I think you're right to say that then it privatizes these political concerns, and there is a risk that it detaches itself and it becomes a form of elite culture and so on. But I actually think that this is not what Schiller had in mind, and actually that's not what the project is about. I think the project of aesthetic education is a part of the Enlightenment project, and the Enlightenment project is a project of education more broadly, and is actually a project of connecting art to politics rather than detaching it from politics, because it's a way of taking up political questions in art and asking these political questions in such a way that you create a critical perspective on power. And so when art does that, and when it's in this kind of dialectical relation with the political, I think it's productive. Now, there's two questions. The first one is the Schiller question that connects to this discussion on dignity and so on. Schiller's answer, the question is very simple, is where does one find reconciliation in the way of hope, in the fact that moral imperatives have a purchase, in the world where just shows you that it doesn't have any purchase. You see this world that's just all going to pieces. Everyone manipulates, abuses power, starts with the wrong principles, starts with the right principle, does the wrong thing. So if you're looking for hope, where do you find it? One answer is to say, well, we don't need hope at all. And that's, we don't need hope, we don't need morality. That's the Nietzsche nihilistic vague way. And I don't personally find it very attractive because I think it's not a productive position. If you then want to take this question seriously, where do you find reconciliation with the moral, with moral ideals? I think in a world where you always see dirty hands and you always see compromise and you always see manipulation, the way in which Schiller answers this by saying, well, we find it in an art that remains engaged with the political, with an art that is constantly trying to manifest these ideas and to show you the tensions and tries to elevate character. I think that's exactly what we need, actually, right now. We need a project of thinking about humanities and arts and culture in a way that is connected to the political, that doesn't get manipulated by the political, because there's the other risk is that art becomes just political propaganda, and people in Eastern Bloc also know this very well, where you have, you know, Schiller and the Enlightenment all become just a regime replicating itself through a certain discourse. So that's also a danger. But I think there is a middle way between the complete separation and saying, well, therefore, art doesn't engage in political questions, doesn't try to ask political questions, and the full appropriation of art by the political and the full subordination of art to the political. And I think what I'm trying to work with is this idea that, as I say, in this dialectic of truth and imagination, there is a search that is also a search for a political world that feeds into reality and that then contributes to somehow elevate reality and contributes to this project of aesthetic education that Schiller had, and I think for good reasons.
Dass du zu einer Vertreterin des mittleren Weges wirst, finde ich sehr gut. Ich finde auch gut, das wäre dann, kommen wir langsam in die Schlussrunde meiner Fragen, dass man vielleicht mit der Politik oder der politischen Welt nicht die Erlösung von Problemen erwartet. Dass sozusagen der utopische Gehalt von Politik sich im Wesentlichen erschöpft hat, weil wir immer sehen, dass der Gehalt von Utopien sehr schnell missbraucht wird oder eben zu autoritären, autokratischen, tyrannischen, diktatorischen Regimen werden kann. Das wäre jetzt mit der Frage an dich verbunden, weil auch in Free, sag mal, versuchst du immer noch mit den Ideen eines Sozialismus oder moralischen Sozialismus, man kann auch sagen mit einem neukantianisch begründeten Sozialismus zu arbeiten. Das taucht eigentlich jetzt nicht mehr auf. Und deine Antwort hier, dass man eher auf die Literatur und die Kunst guckt, ist sozusagen ja auch als eine Ausweichbewegung oder man sagen als eine nüchterne Konklusion der Enttäuschung über politische Wege hin zu Versöhnung oder zur Erlangung von Würde zu sehen. Damit könnte aber, und da würde ich mich jetzt auch mal erdreisten zu sagen, da würde ich mich dann von dir wieder unterscheiden. Damit ist aber nicht die politische Philosophie als solche zu Ende. Das würde ja nicht nur bedeuten, dass du jetzt eine andere Professur bekommen musst für Literaturwissenschaft und sozusagen aus der politischen Theorie rausgeht, sondern dass wir vielleicht auch anders über Politik nachdenken müssen. Und es gibt ja sozusagen nicht nur Platon und Marx und viele andere, bis hin zu Bloch, die uns sozusagen mit der Politik ja auch immer die Hoffnung auf die Besserung der Verhältnisse versehen, sondern es gibt auch die anderen, sagen wir mal die aristotelische Tradition, die ja eigentlich die Sache sehr viel offener sieht. Und ich würde sagen, bis hin zu Formen der liberalen Demokratie, da werden wir uns sicherlich auch unterscheiden, versuchen Regelsysteme zu schaffen, in denen Menschen leben können, und zwar in freiheitlicher Weise und in Formen der Selbstregierung, der Selbstbestimmung und der Selbstentfaltung. Das ist sozusagen das System auch der konstitutionellen Demokratien. Und ich glaube, dass da Räume geschaffen werden, in denen wir uns eben entfalten, selbst bestimmen können, aber wo wir auch Konflikte austragen müssen. Und das ist das Alltagsgeschäft der Politik, das braucht auch politische Theorie, aber es braucht eben nicht sozusagen, um es ganz hart zu sagen, die Philosophie, von der ja auch Hannah Arendt sagte, das hat mit Politik weniger zu tun, deshalb bin ich Hannah Arendt, eine politische Theoretikerin, weil es hier um Politik geht. Da geht es immer um Macht, da geht es immer um Konflikte. Aber wir müssen nach Regeln suchen, wie wir mit diesen Machtformen und mit diesen Konfliktmustern umgehen können. Und zwar so, dass man sie zivil austrägt. Oder zivilisiert ist vielleicht der bessere Begriff. Das heißt, das, was du vorhin auch so sagtest und was man auch vielleicht so generell rausholt mit der Politik, da kommen wir nicht weiter. Ich glaube, dass das ein Schritt zu weit wäre, wenn man das so formuliert. Dass wir politische Theorie brauchen, aber wir brauchen eine andere politische Theorie, die vielleicht uns sehr viel stärker sozusagen auf die Regeln des gemeinschaftlichen Verfasstseins verpflichtet. Denn das ist das, was im Augenblick zerstört wird.
Yeah, so maybe I say something about the difference between my two hats, the writer hat and the philosopher and political theorist hat. And then maybe I say something about how I see, and then I say something with just my philosophy hat on. So I think for me, as I said earlier, I have a certain position on philosophically and on the politics of actually the world. And then I see the role of philosophy as trying to clarify that position and arguing against critics and explaining, you know, what the limits are of alternative positions and so on. But I see the role of literature in problematizing all of that. So when I have my literary author hat on, I become much less convinced about my convictions, my political convictions. Because I think that's exactly what good literature should do. It should make you somehow doubt your certainties. Now, I have, however, some very strong, very core certainties, and now I put my philosophy hat back on. And I have a very simple point on that. So even if we take the very pragmatic concerns, and if we take, you know, the concern with constitutional order, with rules of the game and so on, and with just, let's say, just liberal order, basically, without complicating it much further. That liberal order is based on certain values of freedom and equality, which I think our economic order undermines. So we have a political order that subscribes to these universal values of freedom and equality, and we have an economic order that places everything under the motive of profit. So for me, the imperative is to overcome capitalism, because that is also what is standing in the way of this constitutional liberal order. How far you take that fight to capitalism, maybe we will disagree, and maybe it will be a question for democratic deliberation and so on. But that you need to fight capitalism to have even this minimal liberal order, I think is just out there, very obvious for everyone to see, in a world in which Peter Thiel and Palantir are about to govern the whole universe. So I think that's all I have to say with my philosophy hat on.
Ja, das könnte man ja so. Ja, vielen Dank. Das wäre jetzt der Auftakt für eine weitere lange Diskussion, ob man ohne Kapitalismus und welchem Kapitalismus eigentlich auskommt. Ich würde nur sagen, der Plattformkapitalismus ist im Augenblick einer der gefährlichsten Formen, also die großen Tech. Aber das darf man in dieser Stadt sowieso nicht sagen, weil sie von der Hightech-Industrie, gerade der Informationstechnologie, der Herstellung von Chips ja auch lebt. Deshalb ist das unzulässig, dass ich sozusagen die hoch-Hightech-Plattform-kapitalistischen Netzwerke jetzt hier kritisiere. Lasse ich auch. Und wir hören hier auf, das mit dem Dialog, und ich würde Sie gerne einladen, zum Gespräch beizutragen. Es gibt, glaube ich, auch irgendwo ein Mikrofon, welches, können wir das irgendwie sichtbarer stellen? Das ist so weit weg. Sodass Sie die Gelegenheit nutzen können, bis 21 Uhr maximal 1, 2, 3 Stellungnahmen oder Fragen zu stellen, und Lea Ypi ist sicherlich gerne bereit, dazu auch noch etwas zu sagen. Wer möchte? Sonst müssen wir doch weiter über Kapitalismus diskutieren. Ich sehe gar keine Wortmeldung. Das kann nicht sein.
Es gibt noch.
Kommen Sie bitte nach vorne, weil wir hier vorne nur ein Mikrofon haben. Der Weg ist leider weit bis zum Mikrofon. Wer sich noch meldet, bereite sich schon bitte auf den langen Weg zum Mikrofon vor. Sagen Sie freundlicherweise Ihren Namen, damit wir Sie auch ansprechen können.
So öffentlich wollte ich mich jetzt eigentlich nicht machen. Jonathan Schramm. Ich hätte einmal die Frage, also ich fand sozusagen diese Kritik daran, wie Wahrheit zustande kommt, total interessant. Aber mich würde andersrum interessieren, wie ist das sozusagen mit dieser Gegendiskussion um Fake News im weitesten Sinne? Also wenn wir sagen, sozusagen, es gibt die eine Wahrheit nicht mehr, weil das alles viel mit Machtstrukturen zu tun hat, mit wie arbeiten Archive, wer wählt da eigentlich aus, was da reinkommt, was da nicht reinkommt. Also so verstehe ich sie auch mit der Kritik. Gibt es dann überhaupt noch diese Wahrheit? Und genau, also sozusagen so wie ein Donald Trump dann vielleicht versucht, alles als relativ darzustellen, alles als Ausdruck von Macht der Demokraten oder der Republikaner. Genau, das wäre so die Frage, ob wir da nicht auch in ein Problem reinlaufen, bei allem sozusagen Verständnis, was ich dafür habe, diese Machtstrukturen zu kritisieren, ob es da nicht auch Grenzen gibt, wo das dann auch wieder ins Negative kippen kann. Danke.
Noch einer, oder?
War noch eine Wortmeldung hier vorne? Man kann es von vorne nicht immer ganz deutlich sehen, weil die Scheinwerfer so tief stehen. Dann, ja, kommen Sie doch bitte auch direkt dann. Ja. Dann nehmen wir danach noch eine weitere Wortmeldung. Und Frau Ypi wird das dann im Zusammenhang zu beantworten suchen.
Ja, vielen Dank, Barbara Bussert. Ich würde gerne eine Anschlussfrage stellen, und zwar, ob Sie den Eindruck haben, gerade weil wir uns über Kunst unterhalten haben, dass eigentlich Literatur auch der einzige Weg ist, möglicherweise etwas zu verstehen, was so gar keinen Sinn ergibt, weil es nicht mehr an die Handlungen von Personen gebunden ist, was ihnen passiert, sondern im Grunde gefühlter historischer Zufall, sodass man sagt, der einzige Weg möglicherweise auch zur Versöhnung ist die Erzählung einer individuellen Geschichte, die nicht versucht, Normatives daraus herzuleiten oder Allgemeingültiges, weil wir auf diese Art und Weise uns gar nicht verstehen können, wenn wir versuchen, uns ein Schema aufzupressen.
Und dann hatte ich hier vorne, glaube ich, eine aus dem Kreis. Sie hatten sich auch gemeldet? Ja? Oder? Kann ja spontan sein jetzt. Okay, dann haben wir, ja bitte.
Sonst frage ich einfach eine Fangirl-Question, die darüber hinausgeht. Ist eine Frage jetzt aus dem Buchprojekt entstanden, die schon in ein weiteres überleitet. Also gibt es Pläne für ein weiteres Buch und worum wird das wohl gehen?
Okay. With other book project, right? Yeah. Okay. Das war über zukünftige Projekte, oder? Ja. Okay. Okay, thank you. So the first question with fake news, I think it's actually not so different from the question of the truth of the archive and the surveillance files of communist Albania. I think of it now, I think of these questions in parallel, because the question there is also, what are the interests of the ordering structures that present us with this news and also seem to have no desire to interfere and somehow say, is this fake, is this not fake, has it been fact-checked, has it not been fact-checked, is it posted by a true profile or is it posted by a kind of a real person or a fake person or a user handle. So I think interestingly there's a lot of parallels actually with these surveillance files. You know, you have, and I start the story in my book starts with the trolls, and I say that the usernames of the trolls on social media sound very much like the names of collaborators, the pseudonyms in the Secret Service archives. Because I think the point that the book is trying to make is not so much that, you know, we should think about Freiheit, we should think about truth in the postmodern way, you know, in the way there is no truth. It's more about what are the perspectives, what are the pluralities of perspectives that are needed to demystify the truth and to separate the truth of the archive, the truth of power, from a higher form of truth that we could access under counterfactual moral conditions. So basically, and my answer about, you know, fake news and all this stuff is that For as long as there is a structure out there and there are authorities that have no interest in checking, in correcting the facts, in making sure that there are no fake profiles posting, for as long as there are authorities that benefit from spying on people's lives and taking data and trading them, exchanging them, making a profit out of it, the higher order value, which is where we really left the last question with Professor Forland, was that the higher order value of profit ends up being the one to which everything is subordinated, including this truth, including morality. So I think the point of the book in many ways is also to bring this cautionary tale about how we think of surveillance back then, but also somehow the parallels between old forms of surveillance and new forms of surveillance. So second question of literature and individual stories, I think, again, what I try to do with these characters and with these, the details of these lives and these historical details, I don't think any particular one of them can give you reconciliation. And I don't think that even the book as a whole can give you reconciliation. It's very much a book that is open-ended and ends with a message on reconciliation, which is that it continues with the reader asking themselves questions rather than with the book answering the questions with which the reader started. And so if there is any hope for reconciliation, it's in this ongoing dialogue, ongoing conversation, and in the work that the characters do on the people who read, even when the book is finished and even when the story is sort of wrapped up. New project, I'm thinking of writing a sequel to Free called Equal, which will be about migration, because I think migration is one of the most important politically contentious issues right now, and it's calling for good literature, and I hope to do my share in tackling some of these questions, again with a combination of personal and political.
Ja, vorher müssen Sie jetzt Indignity oder Aufrecht lesen, Herr. Gibt es weitere Wünsche? Ja, da kommen Sie bitte nach vorne, sonst können wir Sie nicht hören. Wenn aus dem vorderen Bereich noch jemand ist, würde das... Ja, kommen Sie bitte auch hier hin zum Mikrofon. Dann haben wir noch zwei. Eine dritte Person können wir auch noch nehmen. Und dann... Ja. Kommen Sie einfach schon, dann verkürzt das die Wege. Und da haben wir die dritte und die letzte Wortmeldung. Bitte kommen Sie auch schon. Tut mir leid, dass Sie jetzt da in einer Reihe stehen hier hintereinander. Das geht aber nicht anders. Bitte nehmen Sie das Wort.
Ja, vielen Dank erstmal für diese Veranstaltung. Meine Frage bezieht sich... Achso. Meine Frage bezieht sich ein bisschen auf die Form, wie Sie das Buch geschrieben haben. Was mir auffällt in Ihrem Buch im Vergleich zu viel Fiktion, die es aktuell so gibt, ist, Sie muten dem Leser viel zu. Sie geben jetzt keine direkte moralische Interpretation der Handlung der Figuren. Inwiefern ist das eine bewusste Entscheidung und inwiefern ist es auch nötig, für gute Kunst den Leser herauszufordern in Ihrer Perspektive?
Ja, also auch erstmal von mir vielen Dank für den spannenden Input. Und ich musste in Ihrer Herangehensweise auch sehr stark an die Arbeit von Saidiya Hartmann denken, die auch viel über die Gewalt der Archive geschrieben hat und die eben auch Fiktion und Literatur als die Lösung der unerzählten Geschichten geschrieben hat. Und Sie hatten aber ja nun irgendwo doch das Glück, dass es quasi geschriebene Nachweise über das Leben Ihrer Großmutter gab, auch wenn es da natürlich Leerstellen und Fehler drin gab. Und im Sinne von Saidiya Hartmann habe ich mich eben gefragt, wie Sie da vorgegangen sind, wenn es zum Beispiel um Perspektiven geht von Menschen, die überhaupt nicht in der Schrift festgehalten werden, zum Beispiel, also Geschichten von Leuten, die einfach nicht erzählt werden, quasi, weil ihre Großeltern schienen ja doch eher Menschen von allgemeinem Interesse zu sein. Genau.
Ich bedanke mich auch nochmal für den sehr interessanten Vortrag und das Gespräch. Ich habe eine Frage, die vielleicht beantwortet wird, wenn ich das Buch gelesen habe, aber Sie jetzt trotzdem selbst fragen möchte. Ich habe bei Ihren Schilderungen ein bisschen auch an die Geschichte meiner Eltern in der DDR gedacht und wie Sie beschrieben haben, wie verschiedene Systeme auch die Wahrheit selbst beeinflussen, wie sie konstruiert wird. Und jetzt würde mich interessieren, haben Sie bei Ihrer Arbeit an dem Buch oder generell in Ihrer wissenschaftlichen Arbeit vielleicht eine Art Lektion daraus gelernt, wie wir als Individuen diesen Prozessen, diesen Autoritäten auch ein Stück Widerstand leisten können, dass nicht die Wahrheit für uns gemacht wird?
Yeah, thank you. So maybe I answer the first question and the last one together, because I think the question of resistance to the violence of the archive is actually connected to why the book takes a certain form and what is the method that I chose. And what the book does, it sort of oscillates between various voices. So one is a straight presentation of the facts, which is why there are pages of just what I read in the files, just literally surveillance files translated in English. They sound much better in Albanian because they have even the grammatic mistakes and the regional accents. And so actually when I did my book in Albanian, I thought it spoke in a very different way from how it speaks in English and German, but we can't have everything. So there's a lot of just the documents, including some bits from the files, some bits from, for example, diplomatic records or speeches of politicians at the time. And they are, although it's just the documents, the files as I found them, they play a role in the book because they move the plot forward. They serve to advance the plot from a literary perspective. So they're there because they take you from one period in time to another period in time, and so they're used to navigate temporal transitions. Then there's my own philosophical reflections, including the question on essence and Aristotle and so on. There's this kind of meta-narrative. And then in the more literary parts, every now and then there are these philosophical dialogues between characters who, have a conversation about, what is dignity. I try to keep them to a minimum, so it's not that because I think literature can become too pedagogical if you overload it with dialogues of that kind. And if you have, if every character and every person and every dialogue becomes a philosophical dialogue, then the characters lose their humanity. So you have to be really careful in how you use and how you navigate that. Some people find it too much. I think I was thinking about the novels that I like, where every now and then, I'm a big admirer of Dostoevsky, and every now and then in Dostoevsky, if you think about, the brothers Karamazov, and you have Ivan talking to the devil, you have like pages and pages of philosophical dialogue. So I don't think I overdid it, but because it's much shorter than that. But I somehow wasn't resisting completely that, because I think it also has a role to play in a certain kind of literature. And in part because of this last question that was asked about what are the means through which you can counter these archives, the power of the archive, and you can think critically, well, sometimes it is by being much more clear about philosophical ideas and how they inspire lives and life-lived decisions. So I think this was the reason I kind of took this on board. And maybe, and this now connects to the second question, maybe this is also the difference between the Hartman, the critical fabulation method, which is there's a number of researchers out there who work when they do, black history or queer history or feminist history, work with this method to fill in the gaps left by the archives or where there is missing evidence, and they use imagination to reconstruct, or they take lives from other characters. I would say that where my project differs is in bringing a much more explicit moral discussion in the book. So when it's done from this researcher perspective in the critical fabulation, I think there is a moral stance, but it's not explicitly brought forward, and it's just there in the method. I think in my book it shows much more because of these dialogues and conversations and then sort of philosophical dilemmas. And that's also because I wanted to recover also something very unfashionable from German idealism, which is philosophical history. So I think we've lost a way of writing history that isn't just, history, but is also thinking about history with a moral purpose. And I think some books of literature and some books of philosophy can help you read history in a philosophical perspective when you bring these moral dilemmas explicitly in the text and if you construct them through character and narrative and plot. And I'd say that is maybe the main difference between this work and the critical fabulation methods in historical research.
Das ist eine Punktlandung, 21 Uhr. Der Dank ist groß, der Dank ist riesengroß.
Ich danke Ihnen.
Das war ja fast schon eine Standing Ovation. Bücher gibt es da hinten. Wenn Sie sich das signieren lassen wollen, können Sie das gerne tun. Ich weise auch darauf hin, es gibt nicht nur frei und aufrecht, sondern Lea Ypi ist neben ihrem großen schriftstellerischen Dasein auch eine eminente politische Theoretikerin, und wer sich für Kant interessiert, auch das gibt es da hinten, Architektonik der Vernunft über Kants Kritik der reinen Vernunft, für die Liebhaber des komplexen philosophischen Denkens auf jeden Fall empfehlenswert.
Aber das ist wirklich schwer zu lesen, das muss ich sagen.
Ja, vielen Dank und einen schönen Abend. Danke, dass Sie hier waren.